Okay. I ended up last time with the Soviet Union just about to disintegrate. Essentially, the Soviet Union went through several hard and firm dictators, they called them premiers, and then they finally got a mild-mannered man named Gorbachev. Okay, I hate to say it, sometimes being mild-mannered is the absolute worst thing that you can be when you're ruling over a rebellious, hard to get along with country. The meaner they are, particularly the Stalins and the Brezhnevs, they survive. The mild-mannered ones either get kicked out or watch their country break all to pieces. That's the problem with the dictatorship. Anyway, Gorbachev was the first, I want to say young man. All right, by your standards, he wasn't young, he was 56. But compared to the old men who had preceded him, he was a young man, active and energetic. He took over and he began the process of reform. And he created quite a bit of discontent. I mean, it reminds me of Joseph II of Austria, way back during the Enlightenment period. Joseph II tried to reform, and all of his reforms failed. Same thing for Gorbachev. He tried to reform, and all of his reforms seemed to fail. Now, there were three countries on the Baltic: Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. I'm not going to write those down, just know that there were three of them. And one at a time, they began to demand their independence. Gorbachev said, well, yeah, you have the right to self-determination, I'll give you more independence, but they wanted to break away completely. So first one of them voted to break away, then the next one voted to break away. During this time, some communist leaders staged a coup against Gorbachev. The coup was not recognized by the outside world. In fact, the United States President Bush said, hey, the Soviet Union has a constitution and they have a constitutional means to get rid of him. We're not going to accept a coup. A lot of the rest of the European countries said the same thing, but in the meantime, the Russian people particularly refused to go along with the coup. The coup got practically nowhere, and within days it was defeated. Gorbachev was restored to power. The main man who had helped stop the coup was the Russian President Yeltsin. And once the coup was over, Gorbachev watched as his country broke into pieces. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania broke away first, then Belarus broke away, and Ukraine and Georgia. Then all the other 16 republics just broke away. Gorbachev resigned and turned the presidency of Russia over to Yeltsin. The other 15 republics went off to an uncertain future. Then, in the meantime, the satellite countries, they began their rebellion also. Particularly, well, your book starts off talking about Poland. Poland got together a labor union called Solidarity. In 1980, the Soviet Union came in and broke up the Solidarity Labor Union, but it continued anyway. And by 1990, Poland was ready to tell the Russians, get out of here and go home. And Russia was in no shape to do anything else but get out and go home. Hungary had revolted in 1956. The Hungarians began to revolt again throughout the 1980s. Their economy kept sagging, which led to more discontent. And finally, in March of 1990, Hungary Hungary told the Soviet Union, get out of here and go home. This time there were no Soviet tanks coming in to stop Hungary from getting its freedom. Czechoslovakia, they had been in rebellion from the beginning. In 1968, Soviet tanks moved in and quashed the rebellion. That was in 1968. But by 1990, Czechoslovakia, again, I mean, I keep repeating myself, but they simply told the Soviet Union to get out of here and go home. And the Soviet Union was in no shape to argue. I mean, after all of their 16 republics were at this time in a full state of revolt. In addition, inside Russia, there was a whole lot of discontent and breakup. So the Soviet satellites, one after another, left the Soviet Union, including eventually Albania, eventually Bulgaria, Romania, all left. Yugoslavia was a little bit slower, but they eventually left also. But yeah, Yugoslavia is somewhat interesting. Yugoslavia was led for many years by a man named Tito, and he refused to be brought completely under the control of the Soviet Union to begin with. And Tito did a lot to hold the diverse Yugoslav population together. I say because a year ago I had a student from Yugoslavia. Anyway, to make a long story short, eventually communism was done away with in Yugoslavia also. But in the case of Yugoslavia, once Tito died, Yugoslavia broke up into several smaller countries, including Serbia, which had ceased to exist after World War I. But Serbia, Bosnia, those places on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea began to form their own countries. Croatia, Montenegro, Kosovo, those countries that once made up Yugoslavia. I must say this about Yugoslavia. The only automobile manufactured in a communist country that ever sold in the United States was made in Yugoslavia. It was the Yugo. Have any of you ever heard of it? The Yugo was probably the worst car that ever sold in the free world, while at the same time being the best automobile that was probably ever manufactured under communism. In other words, the best of theirs was worse than the worst of ours. When they do write-ups, with some limits, and the Yugo always makes the limit list. But, and they had a popular song some years ago about me traveling around in my Yugo, Anyway, now Germany. For 45 years, Germany had been divided. But as the Soviet Union and the Eastern Communist bloc began to break up, East Germany decided to join with West Germany. The Berlin Wall came down in 1991. It had been built 30 years earlier in 1961. So Germany finally became a united country for the first time in 46 years, the first time since World War II. The East Germans, when they united, Germany promised the world, we will not try to take back the land that Poland took from us at the end of World War II. And from that day till this, 23 years later, they have kept the promise. Germany is a smaller country than it was before World War II. Berlin ceased to be a divided city, united. Now I'm going to have a lot more to say about Germany in the next chapter, about the West. They had their problems, but basically I'll tell you right now, the big problem was East Germany had been under communism for 45 years and West Germany under capitalism. West Germany had prospered, East Germany had faltered. So when they united, it would almost be like the United States uniting with Mexico or something. I mean, with all respect to the Mexicans. The Mexican economy is not to our standards, and instead of us pulling them up, they would probably pull us down. What happened when East Germany united with West Germany, instead of West Germany pulling East Germany up, East Germany pulled West Germany down, and Germany struggled for many years with an economy of a united country, owing to the fact that the East Germans were so impoverished. President George H.W. Bush, the father of the other president by the same name, said that a new world order had started. Now, that was a little bit premature, what kind of order was to be. New World Order, if I can find one here. Yeah. On the back of it, on the back of a dollar bill, on a $1 bill, there's a picture of the Great Pyramid, and right under the pyramid with the attached eye is the Latin words that mean New World Order. Novus Ordo Sanctorum, or New World Order. A lot of persons, myself included, did not like the term, and it so far has proven not to be an order for world peace. Nevertheless, it looked like for a while, hey, the communist empire has collapsed. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Now, several years ago, I've been teaching here since 2000, these same authors used to tell us that Ronald Reagan ran an arms race with the Soviets that the Soviet Union could not keep up with. In other words, Ronald Reagan began to build up our armaments, and the Soviet Union tried, and their fragile economy was just not up to keeping up with our better economy, and they collapsed. And a lot of Ronald Reagan's followers, his fans, will say, hey, Ronald Reagan destroyed the Soviet Union. Then again, a lot of people who followed Pope John Paul II, who himself was Polish, said John Paul II destroyed the Soviet Union. The British might like to think that Margaret Thatcher, but I'll tell you who I think destroyed the Soviet Union. If you want to blame it on any group of men, it was Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev, and Gorbachev. You all hope to know who those men were. The Soviet Union fell from within, and that's what the book winds up saying. The Soviet Union had problems. It was just basically designed to fail. They had inherent problems inherent in their system. But something else your book points out too, its multi-ethnic character. Only half of the people living in the Soviet Union were Russians. What your book doesn't say, but what I've heard recently, is that most of the other half were Muslim. And they really did not care to remain part of a system that they did not agree with. So they were not united racially, were not united religiously, things that are important to keeping a country united. In effect, your book says the Soviet Union overextended itself, overreached itself, and collapsed under its own weight. The Soviet Union is no more, and I'd like to say that when this book was written before the present crisis in Ukraine, and it talks like, well, the Cold War is over. In the year 2014, it looks like the Cold War has begun all over again. And this time, folks, the United States is not in any position to win it. Okay, moving from Europe and going to the Far East, China is red. China under communism. In November of 1949, where your book says in the fall of 1949, China was at peace for the first time in 12 years, since 1937. 1937, Japan invaded, and as soon as they defeated the Japanese, they turned on each other. The result was a civil war in which the communists won. The new chairman was Mao Zedong. Write that down, yes. Now, Chairman Mao realized that he simply could not create a utopian egalitarian society right away. Now, his goal was to do away with all social classes, do away with the rich, and create a society where everybody was equal. And folk, in his attempt to do that, he wound up killing at least 25 million people by starvation, more than had been killed by the same means in the Soviet Union. But anyway, your book says that the Communist Party that took over China temporarily put aside the idea of getting egalitarian society and put what they called a new democracy, patterning themselves after Lenin. Your book points out that 2/3 of the peasants received land, and they had reasons then to be grateful. The land, where did the land come from? The land was taken from the wealthy landowners and redistributed to the poor. The economy began to rebound, it seemed. Agricultural production, though, lagged behind what they wanted. All right, something I want to say about agriculture in China. It's more difficult than this here. We can get, with our farmland, we can get a big tractor and a plow up the land. You cannot plant rice with tractors and plows. And you cannot reap rice. If any of you know how rice is grown, it's grown in paddies where the water is about knee deep. And again, you set up the rice in the ground, and then they fill up the rice paddies with water, again, water knee deep. Deep enough they actually can grow koi fish and eat the koi along with the rice when they harvest. They have to get in the water knee deep and work the ground while it's underwater. And folks, there's no way that we can get a machine to do that. So tractors and combines and reapers did not help them. They were still farming the old way, and their population kept growing in spite. And they were fearing, and this is a fear they still have. Fast forward to 2014, they fear that their farming output cannot feed their large population. And this is a problem they still have.